It was Halloween night, and the entire town was cloaked in a thick fog that seemed almost alive, creeping through the streets and wrapping around each building like spectral tendrils. In the heart of town, the old bell tower loomed, a towering silhouette against the dark sky. No one dared approach it on Halloween, for everyone knew the legend. The bell only rang once a year, at the stroke of midnight, calling one soul to judgment. Tonight, as midnight crept closer, I found myself standing in the square, just across from that ancient structure. The air was thick, not just with mist, but with an electric tension that made every hair on my arm stand on end. I wasn't alone. A few other townsfolk had gathered, though we stood at a respectful distance, silent as the graves that lined the hill outside town. As the clock ticked closer to 12, I felt a coldness settle into my bones. I wanted to turn and leave, but a strange compulsion kept me rooted in place, staring up at the bell tower. Finally, the old clock struck 12. The first chime of the bell echoed out, deep and resonant, sending a shiver through everyone gathered. Then came the second, the third, each ring vibrating through the still air and into our very cores. By the 12th chime, we all let out the breath we had been holding. It was done. Another soul had been called, the dead appeased for another year. But then, a 13th chime rang out, low and discordant. It sounded wrong, like metal scraping against bone, sending a visceral shock through the crowd. We all froze, exchanging terrified glances, the horror dawning in each of us. The bell had never rung 13 times before. As the 13th chime faded into silence, the world felt profoundly wrong, as if reality had shifted just a fraction. We all stood there, paralyzed, staring up at the bell tower, as if expecting something, someone, to appear in the window above. But nothing moved. Only the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing up the edges of the square and muting even the faintest sounds. Did you hear that?" stammered an elderly woman beside me, her voice barely a whisper, as though she was afraid to disturb the unnatural quiet. Someone else nodded, their face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It wasn't supposed to. That bell doesn't ring 13 times, they muttered, voice trembling. I tried to laugh, to shake it off as some eerie Halloween prank, but my voice died in my throat. Because in the silence that followed the 13th chime, there came another sound, a distant shuffling, like footsteps dragging across the cobblestone street. It was faint, but it was there, and it was getting louder. "What is that?" I murmured, as a shadow flickered at the far end of the square, half obscured by the thickening mist. At first, it looked like nothing more than a figure shrouded in fog. But as it got closer, the shape grew clearer. The figure was draped in tattered cloth, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, empty eyes seeming to stare through the mist right at us. Someone in the crowd screamed, and we all took a step back, instinctively forming a tight knot of people. It's one of the dead," gasped a man beside me, his voice barely holding together. The figure continued its slow, lurching approach, and with every step it took, the fog seemed to pulse, thickening in the direction it moved. But then, as if in response, another figure appeared from the opposite end of the square, this one limping forward in the same deliberate, relentless way. Before anyone could react, more shadows began to form, emerging from the fog like ghosts stepping out of a nightmare. There were 5, 10, then 20 of them, and still more. "Run!" someone shouted, finally breaking the trance that had gripped us all. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted down the street, feet pounding against the cobblestone as I heard the terrified screams of others echoing behind me. I tore down the cobblestone street, the fog swirling thickly around my legs, making every step feel heavy, like I was wading through water. Behind me, the shrieks and frantic footsteps of the others mixed with the sickening, rhythmic shuffle of the dead, that dreadful sound of feet dragging against stone. And worse yet, I could hear something else, a low, guttural moaning, like a chorus of despair echoing through the mist. I didn't dare look back. I focused on the dim lights of the houses that lined the street, hoping, praying that someone would hear us and open their door. But each house I passed remained dark, the windows empty and lifeless, as if the fog had drained them of every sign of warmth and life. It was as if the town itself had turned against us. Just as I felt my legs beginning to falter, a hand shot out of the mist, grabbing my arm and yanking me into an alleyway. I gasped, swinging around, but was met with the familiar, terrified face of Marcus, the baker's son, his eyes wide and glistening with panic. "They're everywhere," he whispered, voice quivering, his gaze darting down the alley behind him. We tried to cut through the churchyard, but they were there too. It's like they knew where we'd go. I peered around him, my heart pounding as I saw shadows moving at the far end of the alley. They moved with a horrible, jerky rhythm, like broken marionettes. I swallowed hard, feeling the bile rise in my throat as their faces came into view. Hollow eyes, wide and black, stared out of sagging, waxy skin, mouths frozen in silent screams. And yet they moved, relentless and unfeeling. Their eyes locked onto us with a hunger that sent shivers up my spine. "We can't stay here," I managed, grabbing Marcus by the shoulder, feeling the desperation rising. "If we keep moving, maybe we can get to the old bridge and cross the river. They won't follow us that far. They never have." But even as I said it, I felt the lie in my own words. None of this had ever happened before. 13 chimes, the dead rising, there was no rulebook for this, no safe place we could be certain of. But it was the only plan we had. Marcus nodded, fear flashing in his eyes, but he forced a determined look. Together, we edged out of the alley, slipping back onto the street and pressing ourselves against the walls of the buildings, moving as quickly and as quietly as we could. But then, just as we rounded the corner, there was a figure, barely a few feet away, draped in what looked like a shroud of rotting fabric. Its head lolled to one side, mouth gaping open, a soundless scream frozen on its lips. And in a single, horrifying moment, it turned its hollow, black eyes toward us. We didn't think. We ran. The creature lunged, clawed hands swiping at the air where we'd been a moment before. I felt the rush of cold air as its hand missed me by inches, and then we were sprinting down the street, every muscle in my body screaming as I pushed forward. Behind us, more figures joined the chase, their footsteps growing louder, faster, the moaning chorus rising as they closed in. We ran, our footsteps echoing wildly off the cobblestones, barely able to breathe, let alone think. The fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on us from all sides, blurring the edges of reality until the world felt like one endless, suffocating corridor. The sound of shuffling feet and guttural moans haunted us with every step, drawing closer, as if the dead themselves were feeding off our fear, pulling strength from it. Just ahead, the street split in two directions, the left path leading toward the church, the right toward the bridge. Marcus glanced at me, desperation flashing in his eyes. I nodded toward the right, clinging to our fragile plan to cross the bridge and reach the other side of town. But as we turned, something strange happened. The bell tower loomed again in the distance, impossibly close, standing at the end of the street we'd just chosen. It was as if the town itself was twisting around us, pulling us back toward the heart of the horror we were trying to escape. This doesn't make sense," Marcus stammered, skidding to a stop. He looked around, frantic, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "We turned, didn't we?" I nodded, feeling the icy grip of dread tightening around my chest. The fog swirled and shifted, playing tricks on my eyes, making everything appear distorted wrong. The bell tower should have been far behind us. Yet there it stood, as if mocking our efforts to escape. And then, in the distance, the bell chimed again, a single, mournful ring that echoed through the silence, cutting through the night like a blade. We both froze, the sound filling our minds, sinking into our bones. The 13th chime. Again? Before I could react, Marcus screamed. I spun around just in time to see a skeletal hand reaching out of the mist, its fingers bony and claw-like, wrapping around his shoulder. In one swift, brutal motion, it yanked him backward, dragging him into the fog. "Marcus!" I shouted, reaching out instinctively. But he was gone, his scream swallowed by the thick, ghostly fog. Panicked, I took a step back, my gaze darting around wildly, heart hammering as I searched the fog for any trace of him. The shadows seemed to shift, to laugh, as more figures emerged from the mist, closing in from all directions. Their empty, hollow eyes glinted in the dim light, a sea of vacant faces, all staring at me with an insatiable hunger. Desperate, I turned and ran again, forcing my legs to keep moving even as every fiber of my being screamed in terror. I couldn't let myself think, couldn't let myself process what I'd just seen. I had to focus on escape, on reaching the bridge, on getting away from the bell tower and its impossible chimes. But the fog continued to shift, bending and twisting the streets around me, pulling me back toward the center of town, no matter which direction I chose. The bell tower loomed closer each time I looked, its shadowy figure ever present, casting an eerie light through the fog. And somewhere behind me, in the depths of the mist, I could still hear Marcus's scream, echoing as if trapped in an endless loop. Just as I felt my strength beginning to fade, I spotted a faint light ahead, the entrance to an old shop, its door slightly ajar. Without a second thought, I darted inside, slamming the door behind me and pressing my back against it, gasping for breath. The shop was dark, silent, and filled with the stale scent of dust and decay. I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath as I scanned the room. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with forgotten trinkets, oddities, and relics from an era long past. The faint glow of moonlight slipped through a single, grimy window, casting eerie shadows across the room. I allowed myself a moment of relief, but only a moment. The silence outside was thick, oppressive, as if the fog itself was listening. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when I noticed it, a faint, shivering glow near the back of the shop. It was the outline of a mirror, standing alone, as if waiting. The light it emitted was cold, unnatural, and yet it beckoned to me. Driven by a strange compulsion, I stepped forward, the floor creaking underfoot. The mirror was old, framed in tarnished silver, its glass marred with cracks that seemed to crawl across its surface like veins. I peered into it, feeling an icy dread trickle down my spine as my reflection wavered in the dim light. I could barely make out my own face, pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. And then, behind me in the reflection, a shadow shifted. I spun around, heart pounding, but the shop was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me, thick and unshakable. I turned back to the mirror, my reflection now clearer, the cracks seeming to converge at the center, like a spiderweb tightening around its prey. Suddenly, a faint whisper echoed from the glass. "Why did you come here?" I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of dusty books, my heart racing as the whisper faded into silence. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. It sounded like Marcus. "Marcus," I whispered, leaning closer to the mirror, my voice trembling. The glass flickered, and then, like a rippling pool of water, it began to shift, showing a new image, the foggy street outside, where shadows moved in the mist. Figures shuffled and swayed, their faces empty, hollow, yet somehow aware, as if they were searching for something. Or someone. A chill ran through me as I saw Marcus among them, his face drained of life, his eyes dark and empty. He moved with the same shuffling gait as the others, his mouth slack, a silent scream frozen on his lips. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing the cold surface of the glass, as if I could somehow pull him back. "Help me," his voice whispered, so faint, like a dying breath. His hollow eyes stared into mine, pleading, but distant, as though he was slipping further away, fading into the darkness with each passing second. "Marcus!" I cried, my voice echoing through the empty shop. But the image in the mirror faded, replaced by my own terrified reflection once again. And then, from somewhere in the depths of the shop, I heard it, the low, dreadful chime of the bell. Once, twice. It rang, each note resonating through the air, sending chills down my spine. But this time, it wasn't coming from the bell tower. It was coming from within the shop, from somewhere behind the shelves, muffled but unmistakable. The bell chimed again, and with each ring, I felt the walls of the shop closing in, the shadows deepening, as if the whole building was a trap, drawing me closer to whatever nightmare lay in its depths. The chimes reverberated through the small shop, each one like a hammer against my heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that something waited for me just beyond the shadows. The urge to flee tugged at me, but the compulsion to understand, to know what this ancient bell wanted from us, was stronger. I moved deeper into the shop, the darkness thickening, the air growing colder with every step. My eyes scanned the shelves, tracing the outlines of strange objects. Tarnished relics, old clocks, porcelain dolls with blank eyes staring into nothingness. Each one seemed like it held its own silent secret, some ancient horror trapped within its cracked and worn form. As I reached the back of the shop, the chimes ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I held my breath, feeling the weight of the quiet pressing down on me, almost smothering. The shadows in the corner seemed to pulse, stretching toward me like living things. And then, out of the darkness, I saw it. An iron bell, small yet impossibly heavy-looking, rested on a pedestal draped in black cloth. It was blackened with age, its surface covered in intricate, faded symbols I couldn't decipher. Its presence was overpowering, exuding an aura of dread that chilled me to the bone. This was no ordinary bell. This was something ancient, something meant to be hidden and forgotten. I took a hesitant step closer, feeling my heartbeat echo in my ears. The bell seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that felt disturbingly alive. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out, fingers trembling as I hovered over its cold surface. A whisper slipped into my mind, faint but clear, a voice that wasn't mine. "Ring it." The words chilled me, filling me with an unspeakable terror. Every instinct screamed to pull away, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But something in the voice, some strange, hypnotic pull, compelled me to wrap my fingers around the cold iron. As I did, a wave of nausea hit me, and my vision blurred, the world around me spinning. The bell was heavy in my hand, cold and unyielding. I felt the urge again, stronger this time, like a command buried deep in my mind. "Ring it." I squeezed my eyes shut and lifted the bell, my hand shaking as I brought it level with my face. I took a deep, shuddering breath and, before I could stop myself, gave it a single shake. The sound that emerged was nothing like the chimes from the bell tower. It was low, guttural, like a scream trapped in iron, a sound that vibrated through my bones, through my very soul. It filled the shop, and then, impossibly, seemed to echo beyond it, spilling out into the mist-covered streets. Suddenly, the walls around me flickered, and I saw glimpses of the street outside, the dead, their eyes snapping toward the shop, as if they had heard the call. Their hollow gazes fixed on me, their mouths twisting into strange, unnatural smiles. And then they began to move, shuffling, dragging themselves toward the shop, toward me. I dropped the bell, its thud swallowed by the thick silence. Panic surged through me as I turned, my feet pounding against the floor as I sprinted toward the front door. But as I reached it, the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, my heart racing as I heard the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet just outside, growing louder, closer. I was trapped, My fingers fumbled at the door handle, slick with sweat and trembling as I pulled, pushed, yanked, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt welded shut, as if the wood and iron themselves had conspired against me. Outside, the shuffling grew louder, joined by a faint scratching, a scraping of nails against the wood. I pressed my ear to the door, barely breathing, and could hear their low, gurgling whispers. They were saying something, voices overlapping, a horrible chorus of the damned. "Let us in! Let us in!" My stomach churned, the words clawing at my sanity. I backed away, my eyes darting to the window, hoping for some way out. But through the grimy glass, I could see them gathering, dark figures emerging one by one from the fog, encircling the shop, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. They were patient, their empty eyes fixed on me, waiting for something. Then, a voice whispered directly behind me. "Did you ring the bell?" I spun around, heart pounding, and found myself face to face with a figure shrouded in darkness. He was tall and thin, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his body wrapped in clothes that looked as old as the shop itself. He didn't belong among the dead, but he didn't belong among the living either. There was an emptiness in him, a void, and I felt myself recoil in instinctive horror. "Did you ring it?" he asked again, his voice low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far, far away. I didn't mean to," I stammered, pressing myself back against the door, my breath shallow and frantic. "I don't even know what's happening." His head tilted, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze pierce right through me. When the bell rings 13, a soul is marked. But when the hand of the living sounds the death knell. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It awakens the rest." I felt the blood drain from my face, my pulse pounding in my ears. "The rest? What does that mean?" A slow, awful smile spread across his lips. "The ones who were never meant to rise," he murmured. "The ones who will come for what was promised to them long ago." I shook my head, fighting the cold dread that gripped me. "No, this isn't real. None of this is real." "Oh, it's very real," he replied, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "And they are coming for you." As he spoke, I heard the scraping at the window intensify. The glass rattled, cracking under the pressure as bony fingers pushed against it, prying, tapping, clawing. Their faces appeared one by one, pressing against the glass, pale and hungry, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. And then, as if on cue, the door behind me shuddered under the weight of their assault. The stranger's smile faded, his gaze shifting toward the door. "Your only chance now is to make an offering." "An offering?" My voice broke, a mix of fear and desperation. "What? What kind of offering?" His expression darkened. "A soul for a soul. The living cannot meddle with the rights of the dead without consequence. Someone has to pay the price." I stared at him, horror flooding every corner of my mind. I had nothing to offer but myself. The thought was paralyzing, a terror so deep I could barely think, but I knew he was right. The bell was still there on the floor, dark and silent, waiting like a judge at an execution. The shop shuddered as the dead pushed harder against the walls, their voices growing louder, a cacophony of desperate moans and shrieks. "Choose," he whispered, his voice almost drowned out by the rising cries. "Or they'll choose for you." The room closed in around me, the walls seeming to pulse and breathe with the cold, relentless energy of the dead. The stranger's words hung in the air, heavy and final. I glanced down at the bell, its dark, ancient surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. It waited, expectant, as though it knew my fate better than I did. Outside, the walls groaned under the weight of the dead pressing closer. Faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide and empty, mouths stretched into horrible, silent screams. Their fingers clawed and scraped, leaving trails of grime and blood on the windows, and their whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. I looked back at the stranger, feeling the raw weight of his presence. How? How do I make an offering? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to soften, almost pitying. You ring the bell again, he murmured, but this time with intention. You choose someone, and the bell will do the rest. The horror of his words washed over me like ice water. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that I would have to make such a choice. But the scratching and shuffling grew louder, the dead pressing harder, their whispers turning into growls, hungry and desperate. Choose, the stranger repeated, his voice edged with a cold finality. My mind raced, grasping for a solution, but there was no one here but me. And then, like a cruel trick, an image of Marcus flashed in my mind. Marcus, who had been taken, dragged into the fog, his soul now lost among the others. Marcus, who might already be beyond saving. But could I truly do that? Could I condemn him, knowing he was already caught between life and death? The thought was abhorrent, but it was the only choice I could bear to make. Swallowing hard, I reached down and lifted the bell, feeling its cold, impossible weight in my hand. My fingers trembled as I closed them around the handle, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and desperation. I'm sorry, Marcus, I whispered, feeling the weight of my decision settle into my bones. With a trembling hand, I lifted the bell and shook it once more. The sound that erupted from the bell was deeper, more resonant, like the toll of an ancient church bell. It reverberated through the room, shivering through the walls, filling every dark corner of the shop. And as the sound faded, the scraping and moaning outside ceased, replaced by a stillness that was almost more terrifying. The stranger smiled, his dark eyes gleaming with something I couldn't name. It is done, he whispered, his voice tinged with satisfaction. He reached out, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. You've paid the price. Outside, the fog began to thin, the shadows retreating back into the mist. The faces that had crowded the windows faded, their hollow eyes blinking out one by one, disappearing as if they had never been there. The terrible weight lifted from the room, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence in its wake. I dropped the bell, my hand going limp, my heart pounding as I looked around the empty shop. The stranger was gone, the shadows retreating with him, leaving me alone in the darkness. As I staggered toward the door, finally able to pry it open, I took one last look at the bell resting on the floor, silent and still. The weight of my choice settled in my chest like lead. Somewhere out in the fog, Marcus was gone, truly gone. And as I stepped out into the empty street, the fog rolling away like a shroud, I felt it, a hollow, gnawing coldness in my soul. The price had been paid, but as I walked away from the bell tower, from the silence of the dead, I knew that some debts would haunt me forever.